Welcome. If you're here, you want to get past the headlines, cut through the noise, and really understand the important stuff efficiently.
Hmm.
Today, we're doing just that with a pretty significant decision from the UK Supreme Court.
That's right. It's all about the legal definition of women under the Equality Act 2010.
So, what did they actually rule? Why is it causing such a stir?
Yeah.
And, what are the different sides saying? That's what we're digging into.
Exactly. We've taken a key Reuters report, broken it down to really get to the core of this ruling and what it might mean.
No getting lost in the legal weeds.
Hopefully not. Just clarity on a definition that, well, it has real-world consequences.
Okay, let's start with the ruling itself, the big finding.
The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that woman and sex in that specific law, the Equality Act 2010, mean biological woman and biological sex.
Unanimous. Okay. So, legally speaking, within this act, it's tied to biology.
Precisely. That's the interpretation they've landed on for this piece of legislation.
And how did this whole thing end up at the Supreme Court? It wasn't just a theoretical debate, right?
No, definitely not. It stemmed from a specific case brought by a group called For Women Scotland, FWS. They were challenging guidance from the Scottish government. This guidance was linked to a law trying to get more women onto public boards in Scotland.
Right. Quotas or targets for boards.
Exactly. And the Scottish government's guidance basically said that a trans woman who has a gender recognition certificate.
That's the GRC, the legal document.
Yes, that GRC means they are legally considered a woman, and so they would count towards those targets.
So the guidance equated having a GRC with being legally female for the purposes of that board representation law.
That was the interpretation in the guidance, yes. FWS challenged that. They actually lost initially in the Scottish courts.
But they appealed up to the UK Supreme Court.
They did, and the Supreme Court overturned the Scottish court's decision. They sided with For Women Scotland.
So the Supreme Court essentially said that guidance got the definition wrong, at least as far as the Equality Act is concerned.
That's the gist of it. The deputy president of the Supreme Court, Patrick Hodge, he put it very clearly. He said, the unanimous decision of this court is that the terms women and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
Wow, pretty direct.
Very direct. But he also added a note of caution, didn't he? Something about not seeing it as a win for one group over another.
Yeah, that seems important. He warned against framing it as a sort of victory or defeat.
Which is crucial context, I think, as we look at what this actually means on the ground.
Absolutely. So, okay, the highest court has spoken on this definition within the Act. What are the immediate practical implications?
Well, the Reuters report points straight to single-sex services, things specifically set up for women.
Like women's shelters, maybe hospital wards, sports.
Exactly, those kinds of things. The ruling clarifies that these services can, legally, have policies that exclude trans women.
Based on this biological definition of woman under the Act.
Yes. So a women's refuge could, for example, legally decide to only admit biological women. It sort of clears up some ambiguity that existed before.
Right. And for Women Scotland, the group that brought the case obviously welcomed this. We saw that quote from Susan Smith.
Yes, she said it confirmed what they always believed, that women's protection is based on biological sex, that sex is real, and that women can now feel those designated spaces are secure.
But that reflects one perspective clearly. Did the UK government weigh in?
They did. They indicated the ruling provides welcome clarity and sort of reinforces that single-sex spaces are protected under existing policies.
And J.K. Rowling also commented supporting the ruling.
Yes, she publicly praised the women involved in the case, so definitely strong support from certain quarters.
Okay, but like you said, this isn't just one-sided. What's been the reaction from transgender rights advocates?
There's been significant concern expressed, deep concern, actually.
About what specifically?
Fears about, quote, widespread harmful implications, particularly worries about potential discrimination, maybe in employment settings. And we saw that quote from Ellie Gummersall, a campaigner, calling it another attack on the rights of trans people to live our lives in peace. So a very different reaction.
And wider groups, LGBT plus organizations like Stonewall.
Yes, several organizations released statements. They echoed that deep concern, stressing the need to really understand the full fallout, legally and practically.
But did they also acknowledge any other part of the ruling?
They did. They also pointed out that the judgment reaffirmed that the Equality Act itself still protects trans people from discrimination.
Ah, okay. So the ruling clarifies this specific definition, but doesn't remove the Act's anti-discrimination protections for trans people overall.
That's a crucial distinction they highlighted, yes. It's about one part of the act, not the whole thing being scrapped or anything like that.
What are the legal minds saying? The experts looking at this from a purely legal
Yeah.
angle.
Well, some are suggesting this ruling might actually show that the Equality Act itself perhaps needs an update.
Why is that?
The thinking is, while it clarifies woman and sex here, it might leave gaps or create new uncertainties when it comes to fully protecting trans individuals' rights across the board.
So it clarifies one thing, but maybe muddies the water elsewhere.
Potentially. One employment lawyer, Philip Pepper, suggested it might, increase tensions at first,
Makes sense.
but maybe offer clearer guidelines for businesses in the long run. So a mixed bag of potential outcomes.
And the report mentioned a real-life example, didn't it? Something in Scotland with the NHS.
Yes, NHS Fife. They're apparently being sued by a nurse over an incident involving a trans woman in a female changing room.
Okay.
And NHS Fife basically said they'll be looking closely at this judgment and what it means for them. It really shows how this legal stuff plays out in everyday situations.
Yeah, definitely grounds it. Stepping back a bit, the report also mentioned this isn't happening in isolation. Transgender rights are a big political issue.
Oh, absolutely. Hugely debated, very political, not just in the UK, but globally.
It's become quite polarized.
Very much so. You hear arguments about identity politics and then counter-arguments that supporting trans rights has sometimes been seen to clash with the rights of biological women. It's complex stuff.
The article drew a parallel with the U.S. too, right? Legal challenges there.
Yeah, specifically mentioning challenges related to President Trump's orders about transgender people serving in the military. It just highlights this is a global conversation with lots of legal friction points.
But amidst all the debate and reaction, it feels important to circle back to what the Supreme Court itself stressed.
Yes, absolutely vital. They were explicit that this ruling doesn't mean trans people will be disadvantaged.
Because the Equality Act still protects them.
Exactly. They reiterated that the Act's protections against discrimination and harassment for trans people remain in place. That nuance is key.
So if we had to boil this all down, the quick takeaway.
Okay, the core point. The UK's top court says woman and sex in the 2010 Equality Act mean biological sex. This came from a specific dispute, but affects things like single-sex services.
Right. Clarity for some, concern for others.
Precisely. Supporters see needed clarity, protection for women's spaces. Critics, especially trans rights advocates, are worried about discrimination.
And crucially,
The court also said the act still protects trans people from discrimination overall. So it's not removing protections, but defining a specific term within the existing law.
it almost sounds like the ruling, while providing clarity on one definition, might have highlighted where the law hasn't maybe kept pace with societal changes.
That's a really interesting insight. Yeah, perhaps it inadvertently pointed out areas where the broader act might need to evolve to make sure everyone is comprehensively protected. It's maybe less a final word and more a spotlight on ongoing legal adaptation.
It really throws into sharp relief that balancing act, doesn't it, between needing clear legal terms and society's evolving understanding of identity.
Exactly, and the fundamental need to protect all groups from discrimination.
This ruling definitely fuels that ongoing societal discussion.
It does. It pushes us to keep thinking about how laws can handle both clear definitions where needed and the rights and dignity of every single person.
So as you think about this deep dive, maybe consider those complexities. The law needing clarity, but also the vital need to prevent discrimination, and this whole ongoing conversation about gender and identity.
Maybe even look into the Equality Act 2010 itself, or what a gender recognition certificate actually entails.
Yeah, and just ponder that bigger question. How does a society strike that balance between legal definitions and the lived reality and rights of all its people? Definitely something to think about.